Morning everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for having me. I suppose a quick point of clarification. This is actually a different jumper, but I buy about 96% of my clothes from Uniqlo, where everything is the same. So different jumper, but yeah, very much in keeping with my historic aesthetic. I will begin by explaining a bit about just who I am, what the Centre for Education and Youth is, what we do, and then a bit about what I want to talk about this morning, and then I'll get into the actual detail of talking about oracy and why I think it can be a real force for good in schools and in classrooms. So, as I say, my name is Will. I'm Head of Engagement at the Centre for Education and Youth. I began my career as a secondary English teacher. I worked in a large secondary school in northwest London, out in Wembley, for 3 years before then moving into the world of education policy and research. I was an English literature teacher, so I suppose I'm prone to thinking about classrooms from more of an English kind of perspective, but I think one of the things I've been really careful to try and do today is make sure it's going to be relevant across the board. I'm right in saying that you're secondary PGCE students? Great, and a mix of subjects? Great, okay. And in terms of the sorts of settings that you're teaching in, I'm assuming mainly secondary schools. Do we have anyone working in sort of special schools or pupil refer special school? Great, what kind of special school? Autism specific. Right, okay, great. That's, I think, going to be quite interesting for some of what we talk about. That's great to hear. PRU's FE colleges, anything like that? Yeah, FE, awesome, great. So good to have, albeit a small mix, but yeah, it's great to have you in the room, share some of that with us. The Centre for Education and Youth is a think and action tank. So we do thinking, we do research, but the action bit is really, really important for us as well. We're a fairly small team, there's 12 of us, but we are all either former teachers or former youth workers. We also have former civil servants in our ranks, former academics, so we're a real mix. But I think we sit at, I suppose you could call it the intersection, if you're feeling slightly pretentious, between classroom practice, policy, and research. We sort of sit in that middle ground. So, today I want to set out to answer two key questions. Why should we value children's voices in the classroom? And the second question, how? How can we value children's voices in the class? To do this, I'm going to draw on some research that I led actually a couple of years ago now, but we've been sort of revisiting it in various forms since its publication at the end of 2016. The State of Speaking report was commissioned by Voice 21. Has anyone come across Voice 21 before? That's no problem. Voice 21 are a national campaign to raise the profile of speaking in schools. So they build capacity throughout the school system. So they have a national network of oracy champions and oracy leaders in local authorities and in schools all across the country. They are no longer, but they used to be based out of School 21, which is in Stratford in East London, which has a special emphasis on oracy and building that in across the curriculum. Voice 21 commissioned this research essentially to get an understanding of what's the state of play. Where are we with oracy? Where are we with spoken communication in the class? How do teachers feel about it? How do they engage with it? And what are the key barriers? The research involved a literature review. It involved speaking to experts, and by experts I mean people working in research and in universities focused on children's communication. and also people actually working in schools and, I suppose that awful phrase, on the front line, but making sure that we captured a wide range of expertise through those interviews. We went into different settings around the country to see how oracy looks in action and to unpick how it actually can be implemented. It's all very well and good saying that something is a good thing and you should do it. But inevitably, people then want to know how, which is very reasonable. We also undertook a national poll. So we commissioned YouGov to poll, it was around 1,000 teachers, just under 1,000 teachers across the UK, actually including Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, to understand how people see oracy, how they interact with it in their day-to-day work. This is not a presentation about this report, but what I will do is name drop the report throughout. This is freely and publicly available. You can find it through the Voice 21 website, you can find it through the Centre for Education and Youth website, and it's, as I say, it's not behind a paywall, so it's there to read if you feel so inclined. Okay, I keep using this word oracy, but what is it? What am I actually talking about? So let's take 1 minute with the person next to you. Have a quick think. What is oracy? If you've never heard that term before, what have you inferred from what I've said already about what it might be? If you have come across the term, what's your understanding of it? So with the person next to you, 30 seconds a minute, spend a bit of time thinking about that. I've acquired a microphone, which is going to be a bit of an oracy cheat, actually. Who would like to volunteer what they were thinking? And if people aren't forthcoming, I'm just gonna pick someone. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a bit of a clue in the name. Yeah, so literacy, obviously heavy implication on literature. Oracy, it's about oration, and it's about speaking. Would anyone like to add anything to that? Yeah.
Not just kind of discussions, but the way that there's been emphasis on how a child is speaking and pronouncing and elocution of reading and whether they're saying things correctly in terms of, we were saying the English language is so difficult because there's so many words that are spelled differently that sound the same or spelled the same and sound differently. So that would help there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's bang on. That's a really helpful set of points to raise, actually, in terms of the presentational aspects of speech and the physical aspects of speech. Actually learning to say these words that in English can be a sort of foggy mess of things that look the same but sound different, or that sound the same but look different. Yeah, thank you. This picture is a sort of a visual analogy with something that a man called James Britton said right back in 1970. He described talk as the sea upon which all else floats. And I think that's quite a nice sort of starting point for our understanding of oracy and its place in the classroom. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now just digging in a bit more detail into what we actually mean by this term oracy, before then going on to look at some of the benefits of it. I'm going to sort of throw out a series of different ways that we can conceptualize the term and then summarize. But I think what I'm really reluctant to do is say, this is the definition, this is what we mean when we say it. Because as I hope it comes across, it's a really broad term and different people have slightly different understandings of what it means. I think quite a helpful way of thinking about it to begin with is the following. It's something that pupils do, so it's learning to talk, it's learning to pronounce words, it's learning about the physical side of speech, but it's also something that teachers do. And I think a really key message that I want to leave you with today is that I very much see oracy as a 50-50 split. It's something that teachers are doing as much as their students. So something that pupils do, something that teachers do. Oracy is a process and an outcome, and I think that's something that people can sometimes get even quite heated about. But as I say, I'm remaining agnostic in terms of really fixing down a definition. It's important to think of oracy as something that children learn through. They learn through speech, they learn through dialogue, they learn through discussion, and they learn to do it. They learn to speak. Finally, oracy has subject-specific implications. So oracy may well look different and arguably should look different in the art class to the chemistry class to the PE class to the English class. That said, there are some more generic aspects of oracy that perhaps sit across the curriculum, and we'll look at some of those. I think this is quite a nice quote just to illustrate that subject-specific dimension. So as part of the research that we did with Voice 21, I interviewed a chap called Jeff Barton, who is at the time he was a head teacher, and now he is the General Secretary of a teachers' union, ASCL. And when I talked to him about this, he's been a sort of lifelong advocate of oracy, of particularly debating. He's really passionate about debating. And he was saying that what I'm really interested in as a head teacher is getting my pupils to speak like scientists, or speak like mathematicians, or speak like poets. And I thought that was a really nice way of putting it. So another way of conceptualizing this, and this is something that the researchers Barnes and Todd talked about back in the 1980s, is exploratory versus final draft language. And actually, this is quite a nice framework for thinking about some of the activities that you're introducing in your classrooms. So exploratory language is full of hesitations, full of pauses, full of false starts, full of mistakes. Final draft language, really what it says on the tin, it's that presentational speech, something that is more akin perhaps to the written form. Another quite similar conceptual framework was introduced by Basil Bernstein, the sociologist, and he introduced this in the 1970s. He talks about restricted code and elaborated code. Restricted code is perhaps more rooted in slang, it's perhaps more casual, more informal. Elaborated code is much more the strict language of sort of academia, and it's perhaps more in line with the strict frameworks and the strict rules of your particular subject area. I think these are, clearly these two ways of conceptualizing different types of language are similar, and I think it's quite helpful to see this as a continuum. Different sorts of language, different sorts of spoken interaction, different sorts of written interaction are going to be appropriate at different times and for different reasons in your classrooms. What we've been talking about there is really the production. It's about students doing this. But one of my favourite sort of education academics period is a guy called Robin Alexander. And he's based at Cambridge and has spent his career looking at oracy and developing students' communication skills. He talks about types of teacher talk, and he identifies 5 different types. So the first 3, perhaps we can group as a little bit more didactic. So rote learning, it's very much call and response. It's about repetition, and it's a sort of almost more of a drill. Recitation, it might be perhaps short, closed questions to elicit very specific, quite narrow information from students. instruction is very much about telling students what to do. And then the final two are more exploratory, more based in negotiation and interaction. And I would say that really you could call both of them discussion, you could call both dialogue. I think we're looking at a slightly more extreme version of the same thing in the case of dialogue. So discussion, very much an interaction between the teacher and their student. It's a back and forth. Dialogue, I think, is more unplanned. It's more unsure. You're more uncertain where it might lead. But I think as a result of that, it's more empowering for the student. Robin Alexander talks about dialogic teaching, which is rooted in dialogue, and it's the extension of students' higher order thinking. It's getting them to engage with subject material in a really reflective, self-aware way, rooted in classroom dialogue. And this is something I'm going to come back to. I've mentioned Voice 21 a couple of times, and actually I think this speaks very closely to your comment about what is oracy. So Voice 21 have an oracy framework, and they break oracy down into 4 different sort of skills areas, I suppose you could call them. So 1, very much the physical, posture, tone, the formation of the mouth around different sorts of words. We've got the linguistics, so what are the actual words that are being used? Are they the right words? Are they the wrong words? Cognitive, does the speech actually make sense? Does it form a coherent argument? And then the social and emotional. How is the interpersonal dimension of the oracy playing out? How is this engaging for the listener or for the audience? So 4 different ways there of, I suppose, reviewing, of judging oracy. So I've spent quite a lot of time, I think, talking about what oracy is, but I think it's worth spending some time on that because it is quite a complex idea. To be simplistic, I think what I've suggested could fall broadly into 2 camps. One is this idea of oracy as an end product, more of a performative piece. It's about the performance and it's about something polished. The other way of seeing it is more of a means to an end. It's a process, it's messy, and it's more of a collaborative exercise. I'm not saying either interpretation is the right one or the wrong one, but I think both are worth being aware of. Okay, what are the benefits of oracy? So now that we've got a bit of a clearer idea what it actually is, let's take, again, another minute or so, turn the other way, speak to someone else. What do you think the benefits of securing good oracy will be in your classrooms? Okay, let's take some ideas. So I can hear lots of talking, which I hope implies that there will be lots of people ready to volunteer what they've been talking about. So what do we think the benefits of oracy for students, for classroom learning are? What would you say? Yeah.
So talk together and phrase ideas, so they can conceptually understand ideas.
Brilliant, yeah. Conceptual understanding and getting to grips with the ideas themselves, yeah. Brilliant, thank you. What else? Yeah.
So visually then being able to articulate their ideas and understand themselves.
So understanding themselves as people and empathising with others. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so we've got the conceptual and we've got the sort of interpersonal and self-awareness piece. Yeah, great. What else? Yeah.
Generate questions.
Say again, sorry?
It will generate questions.
Yeah, it might highlight misunderstandings. It might highlight areas of ambiguity or uncertainty and therefore questions. Yeah.
They can articulate their own experience of something that help the teacher understand them, the aspect to understand their experience of life on something.
great. Yeah, so what we have here is, so we've had sort of pupil-to-pupil empathy and understanding, but I think also that from the teacher to the pupils and back again. Yeah, sort of understanding of where one another are coming from. Yeah?
I think a simple but important one is just give people confidence to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. It's actually about feeling you can speak up and you can share what's on your mind. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. We've actually hit on, I would say, 3 or 4 of the key benefits that play out in research. So one area that is explored in the research is the academic and the cognitive benefits of classroom talk. So evaluations of teaching interventions that use dialogue, and by dialogue here I mean deliberate, well-structured, well-planned, well-thought-through opportunities for students either with their peers or with the teacher to discuss and really get into ideas and concepts and then to reflect on those. Research looking at those sorts of interventions shows, cognitive gains, academic gains, gains in English, maths, science, gains in terms of knowledge retention, and also gains in terms of transference of skills across different subject areas. Research also highlights the benefits of metacognition, and oracy plays a central role in that. So the research that Alex Quigley has done, for example, for the EEF on metacognition, talk is a real centre of gravity there in terms of being a mechanism for students to reflect on what they've been learning. We've also talked about the social and emotional dimension, both for pupils themselves and between teachers and students. So research highlights where you have really rich classroom discussion and purposeful classroom dialogue, increases in student self-esteem, reduction in anxiety, and also more positive attitudes towards learning. It also shows gains in terms of teacher confidence and how teachers feel about the work that they're doing day to day. And then I think another really nice dimension to oracy is, and this possibly touches on that point about kind of confidence, I would use the word empowerment. Civic engagement and empowerment. Research into oracy shows that where students speak to one another, they're much better at understanding and empathizing with one another's positions, navigating difficult and perhaps thorny and controversial issues and topics, and they feel much more comfortable in engaging with political processes in school. For example, getting involved in pupil councils and so on. It's a really wide range of benefits in that respect. This is a quote from a deputy head teacher at a primary school in Bradford, who again I interviewed as part of this project. Obviously this is a primary, but I think the essence of what she's saying holds true into secondary, which is that without really thoughtful classroom talk, students actually are going to have real difficulty accessing really anything else that's going on in the classroom and in the school. Is that me? Mysterious.
Are you asking questions? Because we've got a mic.
Ah, right. No. So I could hear some. No. I could hear some. It is. Yeah. I could hear some mysterious crackling, and I just wondered if it was me. I was stood completely still, and I could still hear it, and I thought, that's strange. This is a really interesting school. They actually get their reception students to use sign language. So they have a lot of students speaking English as a second or even third or fourth language joining the school at reception. They teach them Makaton Sign Language alongside speech so that the students gain the confidence to communicate really clearly. This is a quotation from the head teacher of a special school for girls with autism. And she really emphasized the civic empowerment and engagement dimension of oracy. So for her students, these are 11 to 16-year-old girls who have autism. They and these, this is her generalisation rather than mine, generally speaking, the academics are okay, but the engagement with the wider world is more challenging. And so for her, the power of oracy, the power of getting students along to public events and getting them public speaking and presenting, hugely powerful and beneficial in terms of the girls' sense of empowerment. I think as well it ties into some really interesting and important wider narratives outside the school gate. So I think oracy speaks to identity. I think at a time when we're thinking a lot about what it is to be a person, oracy is a really powerful way of helping people understand one another and to communicate that. Employers talk a huge amount about wanting better communication from their students, and I think oracy speaks very well to that narrative. And we've already talked about the gains in terms of the social, personal, and emotional, so I think it speaks to the crisis in young people's mental health that we're currently facing. Very briefly, I want to give a caveat about how oracy relates to other areas of literacy. So, yes, speech is very important. Broadly speaking, a literate adult will know around 50 to 60,000 words. However, around 80% of everyday speech doesn't use much more than about 2,000. There's an important message, I think, there, which is that we can't rely on speech that is accidental, necessarily doing the job. Written texts tend to be much more complex. Even children's literature tends to be more complex than many adult interactions. Does anyone recognise this quotation? Anyone know where it's from? It's a short quote from the Bible, Matthew 25:29, I believe. And it's the Matthew effect. Those who have lots will get more. Those who haven't got lots will get less. I'm paraphrasing. This alludes to what we call the beginner's paradox. Language learning, incidental language learning, that is picking up new words just through everyday conversation or everyday reading, is much easier if you know lots of words. And it comes back to that same point. We can't necessarily rely on unplanned verbal interactions doing the job here. We're going to have to scaffold classroom talk really carefully in order to make sure that it's supporting everyone to make progress in terms of their verbal development. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about the situation as we understand it in schools in general, and then we're going to get on to the real nuts and bolts of, some ideas that you can potentially try out. So one of the questions that we asked in our polling for our research was, do you think it's very important that you help your pupils to develop good oracy? And the answer is yes. Teachers do think it's really important. In fact, they think it's more important that they do that than they develop good maths. So teachers think this is really, really critical. Actually, before I get onto this, I'm just going to say a little bit more about some differences between different types of settings. So whilst this was the result across the whole sample, about 900 or so teachers, primary and early years teachers in particular see oracy as very important, but I think the reason for that is because at secondary, teachers in different subject areas see it differently. So English teachers, history teachers, drama teachers, very, very outspoken about how important they think oracy is. Maths teachers, some science teachers, a little less so. So, the issue is not that this isn't happening It's not that classrooms don't have lots of talk in them. Clearly they do. I think a key point here is that some of this talk isn't necessarily the right talk. This is an output from a study, actually a long time ago now, back in 2003, that an academic called Frank Hardman undertook, looking at the language patterns in primary settings. These findings have been more or less sort of replicated elsewhere, and I think this is a particularly interesting study, so I'm going to speak about this one, but the findings I think are more generalizable. What we see at the top, the white section, are the teacher-led verbal interaction. What we see at the bottom are the pupil-led. So first and foremost, you see a massive emphasis on teacher-led interaction over pupil-led. What we also see are that the more didactic forms of teacher interaction, the directing, the explaining, dominate. And that's visualized, that same data set is visualized in this pie graph here. So we've got almost 3/4 of those interactions being very much teacher-led, quite didactic, and we've got a much smaller proportion about pupils. The issue then is that in the pupil interactions, lots of those are spontaneous, and quite a lot of them are perhaps unplanned or interruptions, which implies that the opportunities pupils have to interact are perhaps not as well structured as they could be. I think one of the reasons for this is that when you ask schools what activities they're doing to support oracy, often it's a bit of an add-on. So over 50% of schools say that they get students to present in assemblies, and that's great. However, a sizable minority don't do anything. We've got the more kind of exploratory forms of talk featuring far less. And I think the key message, as I say, is that it can often be a bit of an afterthought. In terms of the challenges, and I'm sure that you're already starting to feel some of these tensions in your day-to-day, the main reason that teachers don't undertake oracy activities, even though they think they're so important, is time. Most teachers see this as being something else to get to in a lesson. And this top quote is from the head of English at an independent school in Cambridge, and she was talking about this. Another reason, which I think is critical, is that teachers worry oracy activities will make shy pupils, perhaps those introverted pupils, feel uncomfortable. And I think that's got a slightly paradoxical component to it. Potentially the pupils who would benefit the most from engaging in these sorts of activities are the ones who are least likely to get them. And then we've got the age-old problem of accountability and behaviour. So some teachers, very understandably, I felt this myself, feel that letting go of the reins and giving students more, perhaps a bit more control, might have ramifications in terms of their behaviour. But they also feel that there's nothing to show for it. So if you could do a written activity and get lots of proof, lots of evidence in your exercise book, versus doing something spoken which leaves no trace, which one are you going to pick? How are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going to talk through these, and then we're going to start to sort of see some of this in practice. Having spent the last 20 or so minutes talking about how you shouldn't be didactic, the irony that I've been pretty much exclusively didactic is not lost on me, but we're nearly coming to an end of that. So these are 7 steps that we feel can help teachers implement some of this in their day-to-day. This is not dependent on whether your school endorses oracy officially or whether it doesn't. This is something that you can begin to play around with in your classroom. So the first is to reflect on your own talk, to make it something deliberate and something reflective. Voice 21 have a really helpful tool for this. It's freely available through their website, the Oracy Framework. They have a framework with a set of questions which will help you reflect on some of the activities that you're doing in your class and some of the ways that you use talk yourself. The second dimension, I think, is setting ground rules for talk. So again, as we've been talking about, it's not necessarily appropriate just to assume that pupils can do this or that they know how to do it. Setting ground rules, agreeing common expectations in your lessons for how you want talk to sound, how you want it to feel, how you want it to actually work. Do students put their hands up or do they wait to be picked? Can students ask one another questions? If a student disagrees with another student or with the teacher, how should they go about communicating that? I'm not saying what your ground rules should be, but having that conversation with your students might be a really powerful way of quite quickly finding common ground. Modelling the talk that you want from your students. So we talked at the beginning about speaking like a scientist, speaking like a mathematician. We talked about the elaborated code. Using the elaborated code of your subject to model to students how it should be sounding. What are the key items of vocabulary that they need that lesson in order to access the content? And then how should they themselves be using that vocabulary? Taking opportunity to signpost synonyms. So if you're a PE teacher, if someone talks about having tired muscles, using that opportunity to talk about muscle fatigue, pushing them to use that very specific and more academic vocabulary. Asking great questions, and in particular, asking why. Forcing students to think, not just to regurgitate information, but about why something is the case and about how it's working. If a student answers incorrectly or partially correctly, why is that answer not quite correct? And allowing wait time. So don't just fire a question out and expect an answer straight away. Wait 5, 6, 7 seconds. Give students a bit more thinking time. Scaffolding pupils' interactions. So at School 21, they use sentence stems, sentence starters. They're up on the front of the classroom. So if a student is picked on or called upon to respond to a question, there's that helping hand at the front. They know at least that first part of their verbal response is taken care of. They don't have to worry about how it's going to sound at the beginning of their answer. They can focus on getting the concept and the idea right. We'll also look in a minute at the Hartness Method, which I think is another really interesting way of scaffolding pupil interactions. We'll come back to that. Providing students with feedback both on what they say, both on the content and on how they say it. How are the presentational features of their talk? And seeking feedback from and giving feedback to colleagues, making it a feature of your lesson observation practice and your own critical reflection. One technique that I think is really effective is putting a series of statements up that relate to the topic that you're focusing on, letting people pick one of the statements that stands out to them or a couple of the statements that stand out to them and letting them think it through. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So I would like you to pick one of these statements or a couple, whichever one stands out to you. And with the 3 or 4 people immediately around you, think about it. What do you think about the answer to that particular statement? If we take a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll share some of those ideas when we feed back. Okay, let's just take some feedback on that. So would anyone like to share their group's, summarise their group's conversation in relation to one of these statements? Would anyone like to do that? Shall I just pick a group at random? Go for it.
Hold on.
Whoa.
Well, I just had a comment about I don't think I need it. Okay, so we discussed the last one. Well, we discussed a few actually, but the last one, as in there's no point doing RSC, there's nothing to show for it. We were talking about kind of the difference between soft skills and hard skills. And actually, the skills that they develop from doing RSCs are tools that they can take throughout their life. So confidence, self-esteem, and kind of the foundations to actually helping people progress. So we were saying that the last statement, absolutely not.
Thank you. Great. Would anyone else like to build on that or take in a new direction? Yeah.
Well, I was going to mention point 2 actually, which is that sounds loud. So confidence is more important for speaking than competence. I do agree that you need confidence to be able to talk, and if you don't practice talking, you're never going to build up that competence to get better. And a lot of students who are incredibly confident, even if they're not right, they want to volunteer information, and from that you can address any misconceptions that they have, and then they can improve their answer. Whereas those who just sit there, or slightly unwilling to talk, never get that chance to improve and learn what they don't know. They just don't, so that's a bit of an issue.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that speaks to the idea of oracy. Is it a process or is it an end product as well? I think it ties back to that. Anyone else want to? Did anyone talk about the third one? What about the first one? Yeah?
Yeah, so we only discussed this kind of towards the end of the discussion. But we were saying how the statement kind of makes it seem that it's just pupil-centered, and we were saying how talking to an audience is part of oracy, but surely it should be a dialogue and how you're interacting with me, how you're listening to what I'm saying, you feed back to me, and it's kind of that cycle back and forth. So it's not, the onus isn't just on the pupils or just on the teachers, it's more on their interaction.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. I totally agree with that. And I think also this is a nice technique, you know, as a sort of lesson starter. It might tie back to what you covered in the previous lesson. I think, you know, you could make it work pretty much, I think, in any subject area. Put up some statements. Put up some statements that make the case, you know, that play devil's advocate, that say things that are going to deliberately get the students to, you know, think critically about the question and about what they've learned before. And let them pick as well. You know, that I think it's more likely to speak to the students' sort of personal interest in that particular subject area if they have a selection of things that they can pick from. So another technique, which we've name-dropped already in relation to scaffolding pupil-to-pupil interaction, is the Hartness Method. The Hartness Method is where students sit around a table. It's meant to be an oval table, but you know, I think it will work around a different shape of table as well. The idea is that everyone is sat around so that they can see and speak to everyone else in that table. You have a moderator who is crucial. The moderator introduces the topic and then essentially chairs the discussion. The moderator does not need to be the teacher. You have the participants, those who are sat around the table, and I'm assuming that most of you work in settings where classrooms of around 30 are more or less the norm. Difficult to do this with 30 students sat around the table, but you can then have a second ring with observers. Those observers are doing several different things. They might be taking notes about the topics and the areas that come up during the discussion. So let's say you are talking about the interwar period. What are the concepts, what are the ideas that are coming up during that discussion about history? that we want to track and keep a note of. But you also want to be looking at the meta components of that discussion. Who's speaking to whom? How are they doing it? Who's speaking more? Who's speaking less? Track it. Literally, with a piece of paper, plot. What is the direction of the conversation between that group? Who speaks more? Who speaks less? And you have a visual representation at the end of the conversation, which is really powerful. If one student has been dominating, you have a very, very clear visual evidence for that. And if one student hasn't been inputting, ditto. I have a slightly second-rate video, which I'm not going to show you. But the link is in the slide. Look up the Hartness Method on YouTube and you can find it. There are lots of teachers showing examples from their own classrooms that you can see. Okay, the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted that I adapted this so that it tied into our introduction at the start of the session. I really, really liked this technique when I was teaching. It was a nice way of both introducing a topic or beginning to think in the broad about something, but it was also a nice plenary activity. Let's do it. Can I have 5 volunteers? You don't know what you're volunteering for, you're probably not very keen. You're going to come up, stand here. You are going to position yourself somewhere along this arrow to indicate whether you agree or disagree with the statement that corridors should be silent. And then I'm going to ask a couple of the volunteers to explain why they've stood where they have. Who would like to come up? Yeah. You don't need to put your hand up. You can just race to the front. Nice job. How you doing? I'm Will.
Will, Dalen.
Nice to meet you. Thank you. Hey, oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So, oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry, you did say 5, right?
Yeah, no, join us. No, that's fine. So for the sake of making this interesting for our audience, let's also have some devil's advocates. So even if you massively disagree with this, let's have some variation. So position yourself, you know, where you think you want to be.
Where's the end of the line? Because I'm like there.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to come to you first. So why do you disagree with the statement?
I find it far too restrictive. Corridors are a place of kind of freedom in the school. Rules are determined by each teacher in their own classroom, and I think if a child is on their break time, on their lunch time in the corridors, that is their time to speak to their friends, to catch up, to talk about what they've learned in a lesson when they don't really kind of feel that they have the kind of space or the time to talk about it in the lesson. They should have that freedom to talk about it in the corridors. I just find it far too restrictive.
Thank you. Okay, lots to unpack there. I'm going to come to the other end of the line. So, you just heard a whole set of reasons why this is a terrible idea. What's your?
I don't really
Yeah.
for the sake of this. So I agree that there should be silence because, for example, in my school we have our routine of the kids having to line up before they go into the lesson, and sometimes the sort of language that they're using in the corridors and things can really put them in a sort of angsty mood for the lesson and create a really sort of intense atmosphere, not great for the teacher or the students. So yeah, having silence will get them and prepare them to go to the next lesson, maybe think that behaviour and coming prepared. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so another dimension of this is that as you hear the arguments, you can move. So if your opinion changes, you can move up or down accordingly. Right on cue. You've just moved.
Yeah.
Tell us about why you've just moved. What was it about what you've just heard that makes you think corridors should be more silent than they are?
Well, simply because of the fact that as a student goes towards the classroom, they are setting the tone for what the rest of the lesson would be like. And if they go into it with a very high distractful energy, then they hinder the teaching and the other students' learning. So a balance should be met of not yelling or causing havoc in a corridor, but likewise not being entirely restrictive and silent, because discussion in corridor is needed.
Yeah, thank you. A ripple. We have a ripple.
Come on, whoa!
I think you get the idea. You can move up and down the line. You can get students to feed back on both the concepts and the ideas that they've heard, but also on the presentation and on how those points are being communicated. We could, I won't for the sake of time, but we could have someone summarize what the main arguments were, one side or the other. I think this, as I say, I use this in English, and I love doing it. It was great. The students really liked it. It got them up on their feet. It was a way of exploring some of the key themes in some of the key texts that we were looking at in quite an active and fun way, and then we could sit back down and capture some of that. Thank you very much indeed. Just out of interest, oh, thank you. Just out of interest, if we've got, so I've been talking about how this might look in English. I think, we've been talking here about something we might broadly term political or citizenship focused. In terms of maths, science, is anyone sat there either thinking, I've got a great idea for how this would look in my science lesson, or thinking, I have got no idea how that would be relevant in my science lesson? Is anyone feeling one of those two things?
I actually am thinking,
Yeah.
I don't see how you can't debate some of these points.
You can.
What's your in which
science.
Subject?
I think I'm finished.
Yeah. Maybe just repeat it into the mic.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously you need to have a debatable point to have a debate.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you're saying this is the way it works. It's not a discussion. It's like the debate on climate change.
Yeah.
There is no debate. It's happening.
So I mean, what do we think about that? Have we got any responses to that?
I also teach computer science, and I feel like we could, when we're discussing sort of ethics of technology and computing, you could have a form of debate. It's one of, I feel like, the only topics that we could use it, but
Yeah, thank you. So I think I want to say two things. Oh, we've got some hands over there. I will come over to you.
I think maths, there is definitely a tendency in maths to not use oratory, but I think one of the major problems you have in maths is not teaching for understanding, just teaching techniques.
Mm.
And I think having a discussion with students about why, you need to have a question why throughout your maths lesson, and if you don't have that, then they're not actually going to understand why they're doing it, they're just going to be applying it because you told them to, but then they're not actually going to understand.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two reflections on your point, one of which I think is very close to yours. So we looked at the 5 types of teacher talk, and we talked about how all of them are going to be useful at various different points. You're not going to want to use dialogue when you are simply trying to convey new information and get it into people's heads. That may not be the best way of doing it. If you want to explore the why and get really into the nitty-gritty of that conceptual understanding, then the discussion and the dialogue might be the the means of doing that more effectively. So I suppose what I'm saying is that this is not, I'm not saying blanket do this. I'm saying that this is an idea. But the other thing is that I think, as you say, I perceive there to be all sorts of interesting opportunities for debate and discussion across subject areas. So, you know, you use the example of climate change. I'm not going to stand, you know, I cycle from Walthamstow. I'm not going to argue with you about the need for us to convey the importance of climate change, but how we deal with climate change, that might be up for discussion. You know, the ethics around reducing our carbon footprint, something like that. You know, so there might be questions that speak to it. Yeah. Okay. So another nice activity, again, as a plenary perhaps, is Just a Minute, which feels sadly poignant today. The presenter of Just a Minute, the famous radio show, actually died yesterday. After 50 years of presenting this programme, which is staggering. Who's feeling brave? Would anyone like to try and speak without hesitating, repeating themselves, or deviating? We won't do a minute, we'll do 30 seconds. Anyone feeling brave? Okay, sure. Okay, I'm not going to be mean and pick on someone, but this is a nice potential plenary activity. You know, a minute is a really long time to speak without repeating yourself, pausing, or deviating. Even 10 seconds can work quite nicely. You know, just and it obviously will depend on the students and their age and so on. But this is a nice way of sort of rounding up in quite a fun way some of the things that you've covered. The question I was going to ask you was, why is oracy important? But if, you know, depending on obviously what your subject area is and what the lesson's been about, that will change. We've pretty much reached 11, so we won't sort of do this in full, but I suppose I'm really interested to hear, just very quickly, if any thoughts have occurred to you. What is the one thing that is your takeaway? What is one thing that you might take or use or might sort of adapt your practice? Has anything stood out just immediately? Yeah.
I think before this lecture, I was quite.
Oh yes, sorry, yes, this microphone. Sorry, thank you. Oh yeah, thank you.
So I think before this session, I was pretty much an advocate of discussion in classes anyway. So one of the things that I'm taking away is to maybe, I want to make it more of a discussion-based lesson. I think you can get so much out of the kids that way and get to know them that way. For me, it's really important to get to know the student in order to effectively differentiate and, you know.
What's your subject area?
Drama.
Drama.
Yeah, so oracy is everything.
Yeah.
So having a more discussion-based, giving them a bit more.
And is there anything that is a little more anxiety-inducing or that you're more worried about with respect to that?
Yeah, I guess it's students sort of reluctant or refusing to engage. I find that quite difficult in the classroom, trying to figure out strategies how to deal with that. For example, in drama, students doing rehearsals but not wanting to perform. And so myself as a drama teacher, I have to decide what is more important in that situation.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Very keen to finish on time. However, what would you like to say?
There's something that makes me feel a bit anxious, and I think it ties back to the quote about it just being chatting, chatting, and the stigma around social being something that's an innate skill in us to be able to actually social is a massive cognitive process, and just chatting is actually seriously complex for a lot of people, but the sort of, the barrier of people's expectations of something that should be just easy, and it's not, and the importance of that and battling, justifying why drama is a massively important thing and why it is.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Yeah. And I think, that really speaks to this idea of we actually only use such a small amount of the vocabulary we know for such a high proportion of our interaction. Talking Point is a great website. It has a series of speech-related activities and support and resources available, and it's broken down by age group. So that's a really helpful resource. The Voice 21 website, I keep talking about Voice 21, they've got lots of resources on there, including self-reflection tools and school evaluation tools. Do keep in touch. I've got some newsletter sign-up sheets at the front. Come and put your name and your email down if you would like. Come and speak to me if you had questions and didn't have an opportunity to ask them during the session. Communicate with us on Twitter. Let us know how you're getting on. And thank you very much indeed for listening to me. Thank you. No, my pleasure. My pleasure.